Hey guys, so welcome to your second video. This is going to start talking about what is biology and what we actually study in this class. You should be watching this with a sub today. If you are not, that means I made this a long time ago or I made this last year. But for this year, you have a sub today, so that's what you should be doing. I do want to talk about why we actually study biology and why it's so important. Because this video is really going to just give you an overview of the entire year. So it's not going to break anything down in super detail, but it will give you an idea of what we focus on in this class. While right now the class may seem like it's pretty lax, we will start getting into much more difficult concepts. And so hopefully this introduction video will give you an idea of where we're actually going. All right, in this video, you should be able to list the characteristics of all living things, state 4 unifying principles of biology, describe how living things interact with one another, and explain how life on Earth evolved. 4 big things. Shouldn't come as a surprise if I were to ask you these things in class. All right, let's go ahead and start talking about characteristics of life. So basically, everything in life, in biology, biology is the study of life, and everything in life has similar characteristics. Everything that's considered living has these 6 characteristics in some way or format. So you probably don't feel like you look like a plant, which is probably fair to say, but you have a lot of characteristics that are very similar to plants. And I'm going to go ahead and talk about all 6 of these things in a little more detail. If you're following along with the notes, you should see that every one of these things has more detail to them. I am going to talk about all of those things. Please make sure that you write these notes at some point if you're not doing that right now. So the characteristics of life. The first one, response to the environment. Very obvious. It's detecting changes and responding appropriately. That makes sense, right? If you put your hand on a hot stove, hopefully your body tells you you're burning your hand, move your hand. You're responding to the environment around you. So all organisms can do this in some way. Even single-celled, very, very simple, basic organisms can still do this. If they feel like something is too hot, they will move away from that, whatever their source of movement is. The next characteristic of living things is what's known as growth and development, or the ability to grow and develop. This allows organisms to grow into adulthood. When you grow into an adult, you're more likely to reproduce. Reproducing leads to more offspring, and more offspring leads to the survivalship of your species. And that is the overall goal in every organism, to survive, to flourish, to create an environment where offspring are able to then reproduce and reproduce. So grow and to ensure survival into adulthood. And in order for this to happen, you actually need to have the right conditions to grow and develop. So for example, if you as a child were starved, which is really sad to say, but if you were starved as a child, let's say children in like a third world country that are not necessarily fed every day, they're probably not going to grow and develop as healthy as someone who is in a country where they're able to eat every single day, get nutrients and all of that. Same thing goes for all sorts of organisms. If they have no ability to grow and develop, they're probably not going to make it into adulthood, thus ensuring that they won't reproduce. Very important, and all organisms do this as well. The next one, reproduction or producing offspring. Reproducing is passing on genetic information from parent to offspring. Again, this ensures the survival of a species. Like I said, that is the number one goal of every living thing, to survive. So that, because you really don't want your species to go extinct, right? That's kind of crazy. If the human race wanted that, we wouldn't be here, and that's really crazy. So every organism actually has that same idea, doing what you got to do, and one of those things is to reproduce. There are different ways of reproducing that we'll talk about later on in the year. Can be very simple when we're talking about like single-celled organisms. They reproduce, but not in the same way that humans reproduce. So humans reproduce, and it's a lot more complicated than if a single-celled organism were to reproduce. The next characteristic, homeostasis, is maintained. This is all based off the idea that the internal environment, as in like inside your body, is stable. So let's say I were to go outside and I got really, really cold. It's really cold out. It's like -40 out, and I'm really, really cold. My body is still on the inside maintaining an environment that is conducive to allowing all of the physical things that need to happen inside of my body to happen. If my body temperature were to go completely down, eventually my body would shut down because the chemical reactions, such as digestion, can't actually happen. Breathing becomes slower because you're so cold. It takes a certain temperature inside of your body in order for the things to happen inside of you. So homeostasis must be maintained every single time. Same idea can go with when you're too hot. You sweat. That's to bring down your internal temperature because you need to maintain a specific temperature. And I'm using temperature as the example, but this can be said for all sorts of things in your body. When you are not right internally, your body reacts to bring you back to an internal state or to a stable state, The next characteristic is complex chemistry. We are going to talk about this in the next chapter after following this video. But what I want you to know right now is there are macromolecules that we actually eat for nutrients. For example, we eat proteins, we eat carbohydrates. These are things that help give us the energy that we'll need for our bodies so our bodies can run efficiently. Complex chemistry here. You don't just eat a burger and the burger is just infused into your bloodstream. No, there's a little more that goes on to it. We got to actually break that burger down. Then the burger gets absorbed into our small intestine. From there, the nutrients gets absorbed. So a lot of processes are going on. Another great chemical reactions that happen are when we breathe, when we need to go to the bathroom, whether it's poop or pee. These are all things that require chemistry. There's a big branch of chemistry known as biochemistry, where you study the chemistry of living things, because not all things that are matter, that involve chemistry are actually considered living, and we're only focusing on the living portion. The final characteristics is what's known as cells. Everything consists of cells if you're a living thing. It's the basic unit of all living things, and they make up all components of a living thing. So everything in your body is made up of cells. If you broke it down to the very, very smallest piece, it would be cells. And those cells come together to form tissue. Those tissues come together to form organs. Those organs come together to form organ systems, and then the organism that is us. Very, very, very beautiful process. So all 6 of these characteristics are all things that every single living thing must have in order to be considered living. And we're going to actually talk about we're going to have a debate sort of in class about a very controversial topic. I guess not super controversial, but according to biologists, drives them crazy. Whether or not a virus is considered living or not. Some people say yes, some people say no. So we'll talk about that in class. Next slide, the principles of biology. So these principles define all living things. So whenever biologists are looking at an organism, they look to see if they follow all of these principles. First one, cell theory. All living things made up of cells, whether that's single or multicellular. Every single living thing has a cell of some form. Gene theory, the characteristics of living things are controlled by genes and passed from parent to offspring. So all of the genes that you have right now are passed on from your parents, who got them from their parents, and so on and so forth. Everything is passed on. Genes actually sit on chromosomes, and chromosomes are consisted of DNA. So it's a beautiful relationship. All of your DNA holds the instructions for everything in your body. Homeostasis, I've already talked about before when we talked about the characteristics. Homeostasis is that balance that makes sure that we are in balance no matter what the environment is doing around us. And then finally, evolution, the final principle, the change in characteristics over time. You may think of evolution and think, ooh, no. But evolution is actually a little bit different than maybe you've been taught previously. We're talking about the change in characteristics over time. We're not talking about the beginning of something. We're talking about the change. And I'll talk about that here like in the last slide, so don't freak out if you're like, I don't like that already. Okay, and I feel like I'm talking really, really fast in this video, so I will try and slow it down just a bit. We're going to go ahead and focus on interactions between organisms, because we are organisms and we interact with our environment all the time. There are other organisms that are completely different to us that also interact with the same environment. So we have what's known as interdependence of living things, meaning that all organisms depend on their environment to survive. If we didn't have the environment we have, we wouldn't be able to maintain homeostasis, which would then not allow us to survive. So first thing you need to know is an organism is an individual living thing. We are not the only organisms living on this earth. There are millions of other organisms that live on this earth. So we have these relationships or these interactions with these guys. Living things are dependent on their surroundings for survival. So we depend on our environment for water, soil, the atmosphere. All of these things are things we depend on our environment for. We don't necessarily control them. We can control a little bit of it, but not a whole bunch. And that goes for the same thing with other organisms. So the environment provides these needs and these other organisms of different species. And this segues into interactions. These interactions can be very friendly and they can be very not so friendly. So 2 interactions I want you to know about right now, and there are more, and we'll talk about all of these things in more detail later in the year. But symbiosis is a relationship where at least one benefits and the other may or may not benefit, but it's not harmed. So for example, I'm going to give you the example of like crocodiles and birds. Crocodiles will open their mouths, and this allows birds to come and eat in between their teeth. The birds get a meal and the crocodiles get cleaner teeth, and maybe you don't think crocodiles care about that, but if there's something in between their teeth, they don't have the hands to floss that out. So that really helps remove the waste or the extra food from the inside of their teeth, and keeping those teeth nice and sharp so that they can eat again. Symbiotic relationship. The crocodiles don't actually close their mouths in this because the birds are helping them. So it's a nice evolutionary relationship that has allowed the crocodiles to have cleaner teeth, the birds to eat. Another type of relationship, which you may have heard about, is competition. A relationship where living things depend on the same resources. When 2 organisms compete for the same resource, one is going to come out really well and one's probably not going to come out so well. So we have hyenas and lions. They're competing for the zebra source. One of the groups is going to get it. The other one's going to have to go find more food later on. And then the very last slide, we talk about evolution. So the evolution of life. Simple single-celled organisms over time evolved into multicellular organisms, thus increasing biodiversity of the earth. What this is saying is that there has been a change over time that has taken a small, tiny, very primitive organism and thus allowed it to change to create multicellular organisms. Eventually that organism will maybe not change as much, and then another will change, and then we've increased biodiversity. Biodiversity is the diversity of living things on Earth. I have not mentioned anything about the exact creation of life. I just talked about the change in life, and that's the biggest thing when we talk about Darwin and the theory of evolution. Darwin, believed in a natural selection. So the idea that traits or beneficial traits are passed on that allow and ensure for survival. Those are changes that happen over a series of time. Let's say I have a wolf pack, and the cavemen, they had a wolf pack. They brought these wolves in to keep them warm. One of the wolves started biting the baby. And what does the caveman do? He kills the wolf. So the other 4 wolves that are there in that pack are not going to hurt the baby because they're going to die. And eventually we evolve to create this relationship between human and wolf. And that wolf ends up becoming a dog, a brand new species. So that's natural selection. And part of that is actually considered artificial selection, which we'll talk about later. But evolution of organisms through natural selection. This only explains how life changed on Earth, not how it began. So Darwin didn't say anything about how life began. He just said there was at one point in our time frame on Earth, there was one cell. And that one cell went on to change to create biodiversity or create different life. So please make sure when you think of evolution, you don't think it's such a bad thing, because we're really explaining the change in our life. You have changed from a baby to who you are now as a 16, 15, 17-year-old. But that doesn't mean you're not like the same person. If you have any questions, please make sure to ask me on Edpuzzle. I went through a lot of this very quickly. This is all just a brief introduction into biology. Every single topic I've talked about in this video, I will talk about in a lot more detail in the future. Again, ask me questions on Edpuzzle.